Flying at 25,000 feet, temperatures inside the fuselage plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. 10 men had been airborne for nearly 4 hours, consuming fuel at nearly 200 gallons per hour. Watching through unprotected plexiglass as the German coastline grew steadily larger ahead of them, they nicknamed the B-17 a flying fortress. But fortresses don't tremble when flak explodes just 60 feet away. Real fortresses don't depend on young men breathing through rubber masks to maintain consciousness. And fortresses certainly don't disintegrate when a single incendiary round strikes the wing root, where fuel lines run like human veins. The B-17 became one of World War II's most iconic aircraft. Photos showed these bombers returning home with tails nearly severed, engines ripped from their mountings, and entire fuselage sections missing. These images became evidence of invincibility. Newsreels celebrated bombers that absorbed punishment and continued flying. Recruitment materials promised safety through numbers, omnidirectional firepower, and armor positioned where it mattered most. What those photographs never revealed was the cold mathematics behind them. For every B-17 that limped home damaged, another disappeared entirely. For every crew completing their tour, others vanished over the Reich on their third sortie, their 7th, or their 24th. The 8th Air Force, which conducted most B-17 operations from England, suffered casualties exceeding the total strength of many ground divisions. By Germany's surrender, the heavy bomber campaign had cost America tens of thousands of aircrew, killed, captured, or missing. The men flying these missions understood something the public never grasped. The B-17 wasn't a fortress at all. It was a slow-moving target, spending hours in hostile airspace, maintaining rigid formation for defensive firepower, offering crews virtually no evasion capability against threats climbing toward them. Survival wasn't purely about skill. It depended on repetition, discipline, and luck. Measured in fractions of inches, this aircraft that symbolized American air power was simultaneously a machine that killed its own crews through cold, oxygen deprivation, mechanical failure, and the accumulated stress of repeatedly flying into fire. This reality is what the myths were constructed to hide. Before B-17s arrived over Europe in significant numbers, American strategic planners believed in a doctrine that seemed mathematically precise. The theory proposed that high-altitude daylight bombing could destroy enemy industrial capacity without requiring ground invasion. Accuracy was the key. Night bombing, practiced by the British, scattered explosives over wide areas, killing civilians without reliably destroying factories. American planners believed they could do better. The Norden bomb sight, a classified instrument of extraordinary complexity, promised precision bordering on miraculous. Bombardiers trained with it were told they could place a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The claim was exaggerated, but the confidence was genuine. If bombers flew in daylight, navigators could see targets, bombardiers could aim precisely, and the war could be won from above. The B-17 was designed to make this doctrine reality. It carried sufficient defensive armament to discourage fighter attacks. It could fly high enough to complicate anti-aircraft targeting. It possessed the range to reach deep into enemy territory, and enough toughness to absorb damage that would destroy lighter designs. Planners assumed formation flying would multiply these advantages. A lone B-17 was vulnerable, but a box of 18 aircraft flying tight enough to overlap their defensive fire would create a wall of firepower that no fighter could penetrate without catastrophic losses. The bombers would protect each other. Long-range escort fighters wouldn't be necessary for entire missions. This assumption proved catastrophic. The first American B-17 missions over occupied Europe began summer 1942. Targets were modest, formation small, distances short, yet losses began immediately. German fighter pilots quickly learned that bomber formation firepower wasn't the impenetrable barrier American planners had imagined. Fighters attacked from angles where fewer guns could engage them. They concentrated on stragglers, visibly damaged aircraft, and bombers at formation edges. They perfected head-on passes at closing speeds, giving gunners only seconds to track, aim, and fire. The B-17's 13 machine guns looked formidable on paper. In practice, they were operated by young men wearing heavy gloves in temperatures that froze exposed skin within minutes. Guns jammed, turrets moved slowly, ammunition belts kinked, and even when everything worked, hitting a fighter moving at 300 miles per hour from a bomber flying at 150 required a combination of skill and luck few possessed. Flak was worse. Anti-aircraft artillery reached the altitudes where B-17S operated. German gunners became expert at predicting bomber formation courses, which flew straight and level during bomb runs to allow the Norden sight to function. The bombers couldn't evade. Diving, climbing, or turning would destroy the accuracy justifying the entire mission. They flew into flak fields and absorbed whatever came. Shells were fused to explode at specific altitudes, filling the sky with shrapnel that tore through aluminum skin, plexiglass, and flesh. Direct hits destroyed bombers instantly. Near misses could start fires, sever control cables, wound pilots, or puncture fuel tanks, turn an aircraft into torches. Within the first months of operations, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at unsustainable rates. Crews flying these early missions learned a truth contradicting everything they'd been told. The B-17 couldn't protect itself. This should have ended the story. Aircraft existing before the B-17 reached operational maturity couldn't have sustained strategic bombing at any scale. The problem wasn't courage or doctrine. It was physics. Early American bombers lacked range to reach meaningful targets from English bases. They lacked altitude performance to fly above effective flak. They lacked defensive armament to survive fighter interception. And they lacked payload capacity to make losses worthwhile, even if they reached targets. The B-18 Bolo, equipping many American bomber squadrons at war's start, was essentially obsolete before hostilities began. Its range was insufficient, speed inadequate, defensive armament minimal. The aircraft was relegated to coastal patrol and training almost immediately. The B-24 Liberator, which would eventually fly alongside the B-17 in massive numbers, offered greater range and payload, but came with compromises. Its high-mounted Davis wing provided exceptional fuel efficiency, but made the aircraft less forgiving of battle damage. A B-24 with hydraulic failure couldn't lower landing gear as easily. A B-24 with wing spar structural damage could come apart in ways the B-17's conventional design resisted. The B-17 emerged as preferred aircraft for deep penetration missions, not because it was clearly superior in any single metric, but because it was survivable enough to bring crews home often enough to maintain morale. The aircraft could absorb punishment, destroying other designs, Its control services remained responsive despite significant damage. Its landing gear was robust. Its structure was redundant. These weren't small considerations. A bomber crashing on landing after every successful mission was no better than one shot down over target. The B-17's ability to land on one engine, maintain control with damaged surfaces, and touch down at forward airfields with flat tires and bent propellers kept crews alive in ways combat statistics alone couldn't capture. But survivability in extremes wasn't the same as safety in routine operations. Modifications making the B-17 capable of flying missions over the Reich also made it a machine of extraordinary complexity and constant danger. The transition from early B-17 variants to combat-ready models flying over Europe involved hundreds of changes, each addressing specific vulnerabilities exposed by operational experience. Most visible was Defensive Armament Edition. Early B-17S carried 5 or 6 guns. Later variants carried 13, including chin turrets added specifically to counter head-on attacks German fighters had perfected. The weight of these additions changed aircraft handling. Fuel consumption increased, ceiling decreased. Formations had to fly lower, improving bombing accuracy but increasing flak exposure. Every solution created new problems. Training couldn't keep pace with operational demands. Expanding the Army Air Forces from peacetime organization to wartime armada required rapid production of crews who could fly, navigate, maintain formation, operate complex equipment, and survive combat. The training pipeline was measured in months. The learning curve in combat was measured in missions. Men arrived at operational squadrons having flown B-17S only a handful of times in training. They'd never seen flak. They'd never watched a bomber go down. They'd never felt the aircraft shudder when shells burst close enough to smell cordite. They learned these things over Germany, and many didn't survive the education. The breakthrough allowing the B-17 campaign to continue wasn't a single modification or tactical innovation. It was gradual accumulation of experience, procedure development, formation flying standardization, and arrival of long-range escort fighters that could accompany bombers deep into enemy territory. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with external fuel tanks, changed everything. Bombers no longer flew alone over the Reich. Fighters met them at German borders and stayed with them to targets and back. German interceptors, forced to engage American fighters before reaching bomber streams, suffered irreplaceable attrition. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken. Fuel shortages kept aircraft grounded. Pilot training collapsed. Fighters that did rise to meet American formations were often flown by men with only a fraction of their predecessors' experience. For the first time, losses were manageable. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe to WW2 Combat Sky. The solution created its own dangers. As fighter losses decreased, operational tempo increased. Crews flew more missions. Formations grew larger. Logistical demands of keeping hundreds of aircraft operational strained every 8th Air Force system. Men trained for specific aircraft often found themselves assigned different models. Pilots qualified on early B-17 variants discovered later production runs handled differently, required different procedures, and had different failure modes. Ground crews worked around the clock repairing battle damage, replacing engines, and preparing aircraft for next day's mission. Pressure to maintain operational readiness meant maintenance shortcuts became routine. Aircraft flew with systems that were functional but not optimal. Instruments showing minor faults were left unrepaired because there was no time. Crews learned to work around problems rather than report them, because reporting meant the aircraft would be grounded and another crew would fly a less familiar machine. Inside the bomber, the mission cycle imposed its own discipline. Briefings happened in darkness before dawn. Crews learned the targets, routes, altitudes, and assigned formation positions. They studied flak maps and fighter concentration areas. They calculated fuel states and emergency procedures. Then they waited. Waiting was its own torture. Men smoked cigarettes, drank coffee, and tried not to think about what was coming. Some wrote letters, some prayed, some sat in silence, staring at nothing, conserving whatever reserves they had left. Aircraft were cold on the ground. They were colder in the air. Crews dressed in layers, making movement difficult and fine motor control nearly impossible. Electrically heated suits were standard equipment, but wiring was fragile and often failed. A man whose heating system shorted at 25,000 feet faced frostbite within minutes. Engine start was its own ritual. The Wright Cyclone engines powering the B-17 were reliable by era standards, but they were complex machines with individual personalities. Each engine had characteristics experienced crews learned to read through sound, vibration, and instrument indication. An engine running rough on ground might smooth out at altitude or fail entirely. Takeoff was the first test. A fully loaded B-17 weighed over 60,000 pounds. Runways seemed to stretch forever as aircraft accelerated, engines straining, control surfaces slowly coming alive. At rotation, when weight transferred from wheels to wings, the aircraft became something else entirely. It was committed. Ground no longer offered safety. Formation assembly was next. Dozens of aircraft climbing through cloud layers, each searching for colored flares marking assembly points, each trying to find assigned positions in patterns existing only on paper until built in the sky. Collisions happened. Aircraft that survived the enemy died finding their own formations. Climbing to altitude took time. 25,000 feet wasn't reached quickly. Engines labored, air thinned, cold deepened. Men uncomfortable on ground became something closer to frozen as hours passed. At altitude, routine began. Formation flying required constant attention. Lead aircraft set pace, heading, and altitude. Everyone else followed, adjusting throttles continuously, watching aircraft ahead, maintaining precise spacing, keeping defensive firepower effective. A man whose attention drifted would find his aircraft sliding out of position. A man who overcompensated would burn fuel at accelerated rates. A man flying too close risked collision. A man flying too far risked becoming a straggler, isolated, vulnerable, marked for death. Hours passed in combined boredom and terror, long stretches where nothing happened. Engines droned, cold persisted. Men checked oxygen systems, guns, and survival equipment. They waited for something to occur. When it occurred, it happened fast. Flak appeared as black puffs seeming almost peaceful until shrapnel arrived. Fighters appeared as dots becoming shapes, becoming machines of extraordinary speed and violence. Transition from boredom to combat was measured in heartbeats. The enemy wasn't the hardest part anymore. The Luftwaffe's decline wasn't sudden. It was erosion that accelerated through 1944 into 1945. Causes were multiple and reinforcing. Fuel became the critical constraint. German synthetic oil plants targeted specifically by American bombers, couldn't produce enough aviation fuel to keep fighters operational. Pilots who'd once trained extensively found flight hours reduced to minimums. Aircraft sat on airfields waiting for fuel that never arrived. Pilot attrition compounded the problem. Experienced men who'd made the Luftwaffe formidable early in the war were dead, wounded, or exhausted. Replacements came from increasingly depleted pools. Training programs that once produced skilled interceptor pilots now graduated men who could barely fly formation, let alone engage in combat. Arrival of American long-range fighters changed aerial warfare's nature over Europe. German pilots who'd once hunted bombers now found themselves hunted. The P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning roamed ahead of bomber streams, seeking German aircraft before they could reach formations. Defenders became defended. German tactical doctrine collapsed under strain. Fighter controllers who'd once vectored interceptors with precision found communications jammed, radar installations bombed, coordination disrupted. Pilots who managed to get airborne often found themselves alone against American fighter formations, outnumbering them decisively. Jet aircraft Germany developed represented theoretical solutions arriving too late in too few numbers. The Me-262, with revolutionary turbine engines, could fly faster than any American fighter. It could approach bomber formations from angles piston-engine fighters couldn't match. It represented genuine threat. But jets required fuel Germany didn't have. They required pilots trained in entirely new techniques. They required maintenance infrastructure that didn't exist. They required runways long enough for jet operations when American bombers were systematically destroying German airfields. Jets that did fly achieved occasional tactical successes. They shot down bombers. They demonstrated what might have been possible had they arrived earlier in greater numbers with adequate support. But they didn't change the outcome. They were too few, too late, too constrained by factors the strategic bombing campaign had created. By early 1945, many B-17 missions encountered no fighter opposition at all. Skies over Germany, once Earth's most dangerous airspace, became strangely quiet. Crews who'd expected to fight for their lives found themselves flying through empty air, watching landscape below, waiting for resistance that never materialized. Flak remained. German anti-aircraft defenses, requiring neither fuel nor extensive training, continued functioning until war's final days. Guns protecting German cities were often crewed by older men, by boys, by anyone who could load shells and pull lanyards. They filled skies with shrapnel until no more shells remained. But flak alone couldn't break the bomber offensive. It could kill crews. It could damage aircraft. It couldn't stop bomber streams appearing over German territory day after day, dropping loads on targets already bombed, hitting factories already destroyed, attacking a nation already beaten. Reduced fighter opposition should have made missions safer. It should have reduced losses. It should have allowed crews to complete tours with greater confidence. That's when losses accelerated. The B-17 was designed to survive certain damage types. Its airframe was built with structural redundancy. Control surfaces had backup systems. Fuel tanks were self-sealing to degrees, preventing small punctures from becoming catastrophic fires. These features saved lives. They also created illusions of comprehensive protection the aircraft couldn't deliver. Areas where the B-17 was vulnerable were precisely where damage was hardest to survive. Wing routes, where fuel lines connected tanks to engines, were protected only by thin aluminum skin. Cockpits where pilots sat surrounded by plexiglass offered visibility at protection's cost. Bomb bays carrying tons of high explosives were single catastrophic events waiting for triggers. Fire was the enemy crews feared most. A B-17 with engine fire might extinguish it through dive procedures, cutting fuel flow and feathering propellers. A B-17 with wing fire had no such options. Fuel that burned was fuel keeping other engines running. Fire that spread was fire reaching main tanks. Procedures for abandoning burning B-17s were theoretically straightforward. Men were assigned exit points. Parachutes were worn or accessible. Training had covered action sequences required to escape stricken aircraft. In practice, everything was different. A B-17 in a spin couldn't be exited through normal means. Centrifugal force pinned men against structures they couldn't reach. A B-17 in a dive accelerated to speeds making movement impossible. A B-17 on fire filled with smoke, blinding men searching for exits they'd practiced finding 100 times. Bailout statistics told stories official accounts rarely emphasized. Significant percentages of B-17 losses resulted in no survivors. Aircraft going down took entire crews with them. Causes varied. Structural failure, explosion, fire too rapid to escape, altitude too low for parachutes to open, damage to exits making escape physically impossible. Men who did escape faced their own challenges. Parachute descent from 25,000 feet took time. Cold at altitude was severe enough to cause frostbite during descent. Oxygen that kept men conscious inside aircraft wasn't available once they jumped. Landing was its own hazard. German civilians who'd watched their cities burn held opinions about men who'd dropped bombs. Soldiers and police were supposed to protect downed airmen as prisoners of war. Not everyone followed rules. Missions proving most dangerous weren't always those penetrating deepest into German territory. Missions killing crews most reliably were those offering no margin for error and no time for correction. Oil targets were heavily defended. Flak concentrations around synthetic fuel plants were among Europe's densest. Aircraft surviving fighter threats died over Luna, over Merseburg, over industrial complexes Germany defended with everything remaining. Bomb runs over these targets were exercises in calculated exposure. Aircraft flew straight and level for minutes, feeling like hours. Flak climbed toward them. Bombardiers made adjustments. Crews waited for bombs to release, for aircraft to bank away, for hell to end. Many never felt the turn. Formation geometry protecting against fighters made aircraft predictable targets for anti-aircraft fire. German gunners knew altitudes, approach paths, and speeds. They filled skies with box barrages. Formations flew through because no alternative existed. Losses from flak increased as fighter losses decreased. Official statistics showed total attrition rates holding steady even as threat nature changed. Crews who'd survived the fighter war died in the flak war, replacing it. Numbers weren't discussed openly. Morale required believing conditions were improving. Commanders emphasized declining fighter threats. They didn't emphasize total hazard remaining constant, only differently distributed. Men who'd watched friends died of fighter attacks now watched friends died of flak. Mechanisms changed. Outcomes didn't. Statistics haunting crews weren't those appearing in official reports. They were ones crews calculated themselves in bunks, in darkness, in hours when sleep wouldn't come. Odds of completing tours weren't good. Odds of completing tours without injury were worse. Odds of completing tours without watching someone die were almost non-existent. Every man who flew knew someone who hadn't returned. Every man who flew expected at some level to become the person someone else remembered. Silence after this realization was the loudest sound in barracks. Men going down over Germany entered systems designed to process them, not protect them. Geneva Conventions established rules for prisoner treatment. Reality on ground bore only partial resemblance to rules. Capture was first uncertainty. German military units were supposed to take custody of downed airmen immediately, protecting them from civilian reprisal. This worked when military units were present. In many cases, they weren't. Farmers, factory workers, and urban residents who'd lived through bombing raids held grudges international law couldn't dissolve. Airmen descending into populated areas sometimes faced mobs before soldiers arrived. Outcomes varied from rough handling to serious injury to death. Propaganda describing American airmen as terror flyers provided moral cover for violence against prisoners. Men believing they were legitimate combatants found themselves treated as criminals. The distinction mattered because it determined whether war rules applied. Those reaching German military custody entered interrogation systems. The Luftwaffe operated transit camps where captured airmen were processed, identified, and questioned. Interrogators were professionals who developed techniques over years of practice. Physical abuse was relatively rare. Psychological manipulation was constant. Interrogators knew more about American units, aircraft, and personnel than many prisoners expected. They used this knowledge to create impressions of omniscience, to make resistance seem pointless, to extract information through conversation rather than coercion. Men maintaining required discipline of name, rank, and serial number found themselves in solitary confinement in cells too small to stand, in conditions designed to break resolve without leaving visible marks. Lines between interrogation and punishment were deliberately blurred. After interrogation, permanent camps awaited. Conditions varied by location, date, and individual commandant temperament. Some camps maintained reasonable conditions within wartime Germany's constraints. Others didn't. Food was constant concern. German rations for prisoners were inadequate by design. Red Cross packages, when they arrived, provided calories keeping men alive. When supply lines broke down, packages stopped and starvation began. Winters were brutal. Camps built for temporary housing became permanent residences. Heating was insufficient. Clothing was inadequate. Men who'd survived being shot down died of pneumonia, dysentery, and infections proper medical care could have treated. Psychological tolls were less visible but equally real. Men trained for action found themselves confined to inactivity. Uncertainty about war progress, about their own futures, about whether they'd survive to see the end created stress manifesting in depression, anxiety, and behavioral changes lasting decades after liberation. Escape was theoretically possible and occasionally successful. Most attempts failed. Consequences of failure ranged from extended solitary confinement to transfer to harsher camps to execution in cases where German authorities chose to apply most severe order interpretations. Men who survived captivity returned home changed in ways difficult to explain and impossible to fully resolve. They'd been shot down, captured, imprisoned, and released. They'd survived what many others hadn't. Survival itself carried weight victory celebrations couldn't lift. Even surviving missions didn't mean safety. The European theater wasn't the only place B-17s flew. Aircraft designed for one kind of war found itself fighting another in the Pacific, where distances were measured in oceans and the enemy operated by different rules. Pacific geography changed everything. European missions measured range in hundreds of miles. Pacific missions sometimes measured it in thousands. Targets were islands separated by water expanses, offering no landmarks, no emergency landing fields, no rescue for aircraft going down short of objectives. B-17s, serving in the Pacific during early war years, operated under conditions their designers never anticipated. Aircraft lacked range to strike targets that mattered without staging through forward bases themselves under threat. Defensive armament proving inadequate against German fighters was even less effective against Japanese tactics emphasizing different approaches. Tropical Pacific heat replaced European stratosphere cold. Men trained for high-altitude operations found themselves flying lower, slower, and more exposed than doctrine intended. Targets were different. Threats were different. The entire war character was different. Pacific navigation was a discipline bordering on art. Oceans offered no features to confirm position. Dead reckoning, which accumulated errors over distance, could place aircraft hundreds of miles from intended locations. Crews missing tiny island targets might search until fuel ran out, then ditch in waters where rescue was uncertain. Radio aids helping European navigators were absent or unreliable. Weather systems characterizing the Pacific were larger, more violent, and less predictable than those over Europe. Storms that would have grounded European operations were routine obstacles in Pacific flying. The B-17 gradually gave way to B-24s and eventually B-29s in Pacific operations, not because it failed, but because mission requirements demanded capabilities the aircraft couldn't provide. Ranges were too great, payloads were too small, altitude limitations were too restrictive for the kind of campaign that would ultimately end the war. But before that transition completed, B-17 crews flew missions testing limits of what their aircraft and bodies could endure. They flew reconnaissance missions lasting hours over empty ocean, searching for enemy forces that might or might not be where intelligence predicted. They flew bombing missions against targets defended by fighters attacking with ferocity European crews would have recognized. Aircraft going down in the Pacific often vanished completely. Oceans swallowed machines and men without trace. Searches found nothing because there was nothing to find. Families received notifications saying, quote, 0, rather than, quote, 1, because no one could prove what happened. Rescue capabilities eventually developing in the Pacific came too late for many crews. Submarines stationed along flight routes could recover men ditching within range. Flying boats could land in open ocean to pick up survivors. Air-sea rescue procedures improved steadily through the war. None of this helped crews going down early before systems existed, before procedures were developed, before anyone understood what Pacific air warfare would actually require. Navigation became life or death in most literal sense. Crews finding their targets and way home survived. Crews getting lost might never be found. This responsibility's pressure fell primarily on one man. Navigators sat at stations working calculations, updating continuously, comparing dead reckoning positions with whatever celestial or radio fixes they could obtain, knowing errors in their work might kill everyone aboard. Some navigators broke under pressure. Some made mistakes that couldn't be corrected. Some performed with precision, saving crews from consequences of damage, weather, and fuel states that should have been fatal. The Pacific War was different. Aircraft were the same. Men flying them faced dangers their European counterparts wouldn't have recognized, compounded by distances making every mission potentially one way. Weather over Europe killed crews without warning and without mercy. B-17s were designed to fly above most weather. In practice, weather often extended higher than aircraft could climb. Winter operations brought conditions challenging every system aboard bombers. Ice accumulated on wings and control surfaces, changing aircraft aerodynamic characteristics in ways that couldn't be fully predicted. Desing systems existed, but were imperfect. Boots breaking ice from leading edges couldn't clear accumulation forming in areas designers hadn't anticipated. Cold at altitude was constant, but cold inside clouds was different. Moisture having no effect in clear air became ice crystals finding every gap in heated suits, every opening in oxygen masks, every human body vulnerability. Men functioning adequately in clear air cold became incapacitated in winter clouds wet cold. Instruments crews relied upon were vulnerable to same conditions. Pitot tubes iced over, giving false airspeed readings. Altimeters became unreliable in rapid pressure change conditions. Gyroscopes tumbled in severe turbulence. Aircraft seeming controllable in stable air became uncertain in conditions scrambling every information source. Formation flying in cloud was theoretically impossible and practically necessary. Crews entering weather maintained positions through discipline and hope. They couldn't see aircraft around them. They could only trust everyone was following same procedures, making same decisions, avoiding same collisions. Collisions happened anyway. Aircraft surviving everything the enemy offered died striking friendly bombers in cloud. Closing speeds were low. Damage was total. No time to react. No possibility of escape. No chance for parachutes. Weather briefings predicted conditions with accuracy the era's science permitted. Many missions launched into weather worse than forecast. Others launched into better weather, only to find return journeys blocked by fronts moving faster than predicted. Diversionary fields existed across England for aircraft that couldn't return to home bases. Procedures for finding these fields in bad weather were imperfect. Aircraft low on fuel, with wounded aboard, with damaged systems searched for runways they couldn't see, while options narrowed with every passing minute. January and February periods in any given year of strategic bombing campaigns produced losses reflecting weather as much as enemy action. Multiple aircraft would fail to return from missions where opposition was light, where targets were reached, where everything went according to plan except flight home. Investigations following often produced inconclusive results. Aircraft disappearing over North Sea in winter storms left no evidence to examine. Crews failing to return from fog-bound approaches couldn't explain what went wrong. Losses were recorded. Next missions were planned. The war continued. Ice was the killer, requiring no enemy. B-17s carrying several hundred pounds of ice flew differently than clean ones. Stall speed increased. Control response degraded. Margins separating safe flight from loss of control narrowed until they vanished entirely. Pilots recognizing ice accumulation could attempt descending to warmer air. This option disappeared when weather extended to surface, when terrain below was hostile, when fuel state didn't permit route deviation. Crews flying winter months learned to fear weather in ways summer crews didn't fully understand. Cold was always present, but cold, combined with moisture, with darkness, with accumulated fatigue of long missions through instrument conditions, produced threats no amount of armament could answer. Hardest winter missions produced casualties without a single shell fired in opposition. War's final months should have been safer. Enemy air force was broken. Flak defenses were depleted. Targets were shorter range as Allied ground forces advanced. Every factor making early missions deadly had diminished. Losses continued. Men flying in European war's final months often weren't same men who'd flown in costly days of 1943 and early 1944. Replacement crews arrived with training shorter and less comprehensive than earlier cohorts had received. Urgency characterizing training pipelines when war was in doubt relaxed slightly as victory seemed assured. These newer crews made mistakes experienced crews would have avoided. They flew formation positions incorrectly. They managed fuel states poorly. They responded to emergencies with procedures technically correct but tactically inappropriate for specific circumstances. Experienced crews remaining were tired in ways going beyond physical fatigue. Mental strain of flying mission after mission, watching losses accumulate, wondering when probability would catch up with them personally, produced brittleness, affecting judgment. Men who'd survived 20 missions flew their 21st with less caution than they'd applied to their third. Routine bred contempt for dangers not yet materialized. Near misses, once triggering careful analysis, became incidents dismissed, forgotten, filed away as evidence of continued luck. Aircraft themselves showed strain. B-17 SOs flying dozens of missions were maintained, repaired, and returned to service repeatedly. Fatigue accumulating in metal structures was invisible until becoming catastrophic. Airframes, stressed beyond design limits in combat, held together until they didn't. Accidents characterizing final months were often prosaic. Engine failures on takeoff, landing gear collapses, brake failures on wet runways, fuel system malfunctions starving engines at worst possible moments. Each incident killed crews as thoroughly as enemy action would have. Operational pace, which should have relaxed as victory approached, actually intensified. Strategic bombing campaigns sought to complete German industrial capacity destruction before ground war ended. Commanders who'd husbanded resources during uncertain middle years spent them freely as end came into view. Aircraft that would have been grounded for maintenance in earlier periods flew with discrepancies documented but not corrected. Crews that would have been stood down for rest flew additional missions because targets were available and opposition was light. Assumptions that lighter opposition meant safer missions proved false. Baseline hazards of heavy bomber operations, dangers inherent in flying complex machines at performance envelope edges, in weather challenging human physiology, through air that could kill without warning, remained constant regardless of enemy activity. Statistics from final months showed attrition continuing at rates higher than reduced threat should have produced. Cause wasn't enemy action. Cause was accumulated wear on machines and men fighting for years. War was ending. Dying wasn't. Among thousands of crews flying B-17s over Europe, some stood out only because their stories were documented when so many others weren't. Men boarding aircraft for final missions weren't different from those returning. They weren't less skilled, less careful, or less deserving of survival. They were simply those whose luck ran out on particular days. Crews becoming representative weren't famous. They weren't mentioned in major histories. Their aircraft carried nose art that became iconic. They flew missions, wrote letters, attended briefings, and prepared for sorties that would become their last. Mornings of final missions began like every other. Wake-up calls came in darkness. Mess halls served same food. Briefing rooms contained same maps, same pointers, same officers explaining targets, routes, and expected opposition. Nothing in briefings suggested these missions would be different. Targets were marshalling yards, routine objectives in war's final months. Opposition was expected to be light. Weather was acceptable. Every indicator suggested missions that would be completed without incident. Crews dressed in same layers they'd worn for every previous mission. They collected same equipment. They walked to same aircraft they'd flown before. Pre-flight inspections revealed nothing unusual. Engines started normally. Taxi to runway proceeded without incident. Takeoffs were routine. Formation assemblies were routine. Climbs to altitude were routine. Missions progressed exactly as briefed until they no longer did. What changed was never fully determined. Aircraft fell out of formation somewhere over Germany. Whether causes were mechanical failure, enemy action, crew incapacitation, or something else entirely was never established. Aircraft went down. Crews didn't survive. Losses were reported through channels. Families received notifications. Personal effects were inventoried and returned. Bunks were cleared for replacement crews arriving within days. Missions killing these crews weren't war's worst missions. They weren't most dangerous, longest, or most costly. They were missions among thousands, losses among tens of thousands, crews among multitudes who flew B-17s and didn't return. Randomness was the point. Men dying on these missions had done everything correctly. They'd trained, they'd practiced. They'd flown previous missions successfully. They'd accumulated experience that should have protected them. They'd survived long enough to believe survival was possible. Then they died anyway. Crews surviving similar missions didn't do so because they were better. They did so because shells that would have hit their aircraft burst 10 feet further away. They did so because mechanical failures that would have killed them happened to aircraft next to them. They did so because chance, in its absolute indifference, selected someone else. This was truth no briefing ever stated directly. Skill mattered, training mattered, discipline mattered, but probability was final arbiter, and probability didn't care about any of it. European war ended May 1945. Announcements came through channels carrying nothing but mission orders and loss reports for years. Suddenly, purpose organizing every aspect of life on bomber bases disappeared. Men remaining weren't same men who'd arrived. They were older in ways years couldn't measure. They'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. They'd lost friends whose faces they'd remember for rest of their lives. Celebrations were real, but complicated. Relief of survival mixed with guilt of having survived when others hadn't. Joy of going home mixed with uncertainty about what home would mean after everything that happened. For crews lost in final weeks, the end came too late. Men surviving years of combat died in April, in last days of organized German resistance. Men completing most of their tours fell on final missions. Men who should have been there for celebrations were instead listed on rosters of the missing. Families receiving notifications in May 1945 experienced war's end differently than those welcoming returning sons and husbands. For them, Victory was hollow. Cause had been won, but cost had been paid by people who'd never know the outcome. Remains recovery continued months after fighting stopped. Teams searched crash sites, examined wreckage, tried to identify bodies buried in haste or not buried at all. Many were never found. Graves marked unknown outnumber those with names. Prisoners surviving captivity came home to a world that moved on without them. They'd been frozen in time while history continued. They returned to find families changed, communities transformed, a nation that won a war and wanted to celebrate, not dwell on costs. Silence about what actually happened inside bomber campaigns persisted for decades. Official histories emphasized strategic importance. Tonnage dropped, targets destroyed. Human costs were acknowledged in aggregate in statistics that could be absorbed without feeling. Individual stories, losses destroying families, wounds never fully healing, were told quietly, if told at all. Men who survived often didn't speak about what they'd experienced. Men who hadn't survived couldn't speak at all. Aircraft carrying them into combat were scrapped, melted down, recycled into civilian economy the war made possible. A few were preserved. Most disappeared, their aluminum becoming cars, appliances, and building materials bearing no trace of what they'd once been. Crews flying them became memories, then stories, then footnotes in histories emphasizing strategy over experience. War ended, dying stopped, forgetting began. The B-17 Flying Fortress became legend in decades after war ended. Aircraft surviving were restored, displayed in museums, flown at air shows. Images of battered bombers returning from Reich became symbols of American determination and engineering excellence. Myth solidified around specific examples. Aircraft flying home with impossible damage, crews completing tours against astronomical odds, statistics showing more bombs dropped on Germany than any other weapon system delivered. Narrative emphasized success, resilience, victory. What myth excluded was everything else. Crews not coming home, aircraft going down on their first missions or 5th or 24th, men surviving combat only to die in captivity, in accidents, in slow aftermath of wounds never fully healing. Veterans gathering at reunions grew older and fewer with each passing year. They told stories sometimes matching myth and sometimes contradicting it. They remembered cold, fear, moments believing they wouldn't survive. They remembered friends who didn't survive, whose names they repeated like prayers. Aircraft flying today carry tourists and enthusiasts experiencing something approximating the original without touching its reality. Engines roar. Fuselages vibrate. Views through plexiglass are spectacular. Experiences are memorable. It isn't the same. Original experience included certainty someone was trying to kill you. It included knowledge your aircraft was one among hundreds. That flak was aimed at formations, not individuals. That individual skill couldn't guarantee survival. It included cold going beyond discomfort into medical emergency territory. It included oxygen deprivation that could kill without warning if equipment failed. It included watching friends die. Men who flew B-17s in combat carried something with them for the rest of their lives. Some called it pride. Some called it trauma. Most called it nothing at all because there were no words capturing what they'd experienced and no audience that could truly understand. When people talk about B-17s today, they talk about aircraft. They talk about design, performance, armament, records. They talk about success measured in bombs dropped and targets destroyed. But for people who flew them, success was measured differently. Success was completing missions when aircraft ahead of you exploded. Success was landing with wounded aboard and no hydraulics. Success was breathing when oxygen systems failed. Success was surviving what came after. The myth remembers the fortress. The truth remembers men who discovered no fortress could protect them from the war they'd been sent to fight.